Welcome to Studio 708. I'm Susan. In today's video, we are going to learn the basics of foundation paper piecing, FPP for short. I will be using the free heart pattern, and you can go to studio708.com to download that for free. After we cover the basics, I will show you how I finished the edges to use on the By Any pattern Grab Some Grub 2.0. You can go to By Any's website to download that pattern. Let's get started. Let's cover some basic tools that you're going to need to start with. Some paper scissors, because you're actually going to be cutting on paper as well as fabric. A presser, a roller presser. Mine's very squeaky, but to press the seams on your fabric instead of having to use your iron every time. Saves you from getting up and down, and also saves your fabric from getting scorched. A pair of fabric scissors. I kind of like these little ones from Tula Pink. They also have a serrated edge on them, which make them very easy to grab the fabric with. It doesn't try to run away from you. I know if you've cut anything, you've experienced that before. A rotary cutter. I also use a glue stick. I'm using the Soline one. You could also use the Elmer's, just a kid's school glue, the purple glue, as long as it's water soluble and can be washed away. Another one is the Add an 1/8 Plus ruler. This one has a little lip on the back, so when we're putting our fabric underneath it, it will catch on that little lip, and then our rotary cutter will cut right on the edge to get us at a very even 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I am using Aurifil 50 weight thread in my bobbin and in the top to sew this. It's a thinner weight thread that will keep the bulk out of the stitches. I'm using a 9014 top stitch needle. And then you might want to have a couple of clips or some pins handy when we go to sew the two pieces together. So the last thing you're going to need, you're going to need some fabric. So I have my main fabric for the heart, and then I have the white fabric for my background. Now the last thing you need is going to be your pattern. We're going to end up cutting this part out and sewing on this part. Make sure when you print this that your printing is coming out to equal 1 inch square or 3 centimeter square. Just make sure this matches up or this will not be the right size. So right now I'm going to go ahead and cut out our pattern so we can get started here. Okay, you're going to notice that you have a section A and a section B, and you've got some squares with numbers in them. Some of them are black and some of them are white. These are going to be directions to tell you what order to sew things in and which fabrics to use. So we're going to start with section A. The black number here is our number 1. The black indicates that that's going to be our main fabric. So for me, that's going to be the red fabric for the heart. And the 2, 3, 4 are in white. That means it will be my background fabric. So we're going to start with 1, then we'll sew on piece 2, then piece 3, and then piece 4. We'll be done with this section, and then we'll move to piece B, and we will do the same thing, and then we'll attach the two pieces together. You'll notice when I cut out my pattern, I did not cut directly on the dotted line. I cut outside of that. I want to give myself a little bit of room so that whenever I'm finished sewing the FPP part, that I can actually cut on the dotted line and have a very clean finished 1/4 of an inch seam allowance there. So the other thing to note with FPP is what you see right here is actually going to be the reverse, because we're going to be putting our fabric on the back and we're going to be sewing the right side up here. So everything feels a little bit upside down at the beginning, but the good thing about this pattern is it is symmetrical, not asymmetrical. So when you do this, it's going to be the same on either side and it won't matter. But just keep that in mind for future reference. So first things off, we're going to find a piece of our main fabric that is big enough to cover this A section. So you can work on top of a light board if you want, but this piece is so small that you should be able to just lay it on here and find a piece that will fit. So basically I'm going to cut a rectangle about the size of my pattern here so that I can make sure that I'm covering all these points. It's always easier to start with a bigger piece of fabric when you're beginning, and then as you get more experienced, you can start with a smaller piece of fabric or one that's more the size of what you're going to want to do. So I have a very large piece of fabric for this, but that'll give you a good idea of what we're going to do and how it works. So I'm kind of gathering up my supplies here again. Okay, so for me, this is all loose right now, and I need piece A is relatively large. So I am going to glue this paper down to the fabric, and I'm really just going to put glue right behind the A section. And then I'm going to stick it onto my fabric, making sure that I have the fabric all the way up to these points and down here. That'll just help hold it in place while we're doing the other sections. So now I've done A, I've done A1, and now I'm going to move on to A2. So I'm going to get my background fabric. I want to fold along this line right here. This is going to be my stitch line. I'm going to fold along that, and then we can trim this extra red off, but don't trim too close because we want to get our good seam allowance later. So just trim that off so you can see easier where we're going to be. Okay, we have the right side up of our base fabric, and I'm laying this on here, and I want a piece big enough to cover this whole section that I folded over right here. So be good to just cut a larger one once again until you get used to doing this, and that way you know for sure you have plenty of fabric. Okay, so we have right side up. We have right side down, and we're going to line this up where we're still covering all those angles, and we're going to flip our piece of paper back, and then we are going to take this to the machine. We are going to sew from right here all the way to right here, so off the paper to off the paper. My stitch length is set at 1.1, 1.2. You can go up to 1.5, but I feel like the smaller the stitches are, the easier it is to get the paper out at the end. So let me just run this in my machine really quick. Okay, I do not use the auto cut feature on my machine. I go ahead and just lift the needle and then pull this out so that I'm not pulling any of those threads out that we just sewed. Okay, so now we've sewn on our line right there. We are going to fold that piece of paper back over, and then grab your 1/8 of an inch ruler, add an 1/8 ruler, and see how it's grabbing. So it gives us that good easy edge right there. We don't have to try to hold the ruler still, it's going to hold itself. And we're just cutting off our extra. You might want to have a trash can nearby. I should probably add that to the supplies because there's always lots of trash with this project. Okay, and now we're folding this back. So this fabric, so it's probably hard to see, but this is the right side of my fabric and the right side of my fabric. So we've just folded this back, and we're going to press that seam down. Now we're going to move on to piece 3, which is this A right here. Same thing, we're going to fold on that line. And if we stitched over this right here, you might need to break that a little bit, but that's okay. And then we're going to grab our fabric and do the same thing. So I need a piece that's big enough to do that, and that little corner will work just fine. Same thing, right side up and right side down. We're going to line this up, flip our piece of paper back, take this to the machine and stitch along that line. Okay, we've stitched along this line right here. We're going to fold this piece of paper back, grab our add an 1/8 ruler, and cut off the excess. And then flip it over and open your seam. Oops, got some threads in there. And then press your seam flat. Okay, we only have one more piece to do on this, and that is this big piece down here. So I'm going to take my pattern and fold along that line. And see, I've sewn over this section right here, so I'm going to have to kind of tear the paper there a little bit. The seam is really going to come all the way out here to the edge, so if you want to fold the rest, you can. And then I'm just going to get this excess out of the way. Grab your background fabric, and we're going to find a piece right here. And we're going to put our right sides together, making sure that we've got this corner and this corner on our fabric, and this corner. Got quite a few things to watch, but you can do it. Then flip our paper back, take it to the machine and stitch. Then we're going to fold our piece of paper back again, grab our add an 1/8 ruler, and cut off our excess. And then flip our fabric back and press. Okay, now if I can find that little thread in there, we'll get it out. I'll get to it in a minute. Okay, so this is our heart pattern now, our half. So we've done section A. What we're going to do now is glue down these little edges again, just to keep them held down because we need to trim up our block. So just a little dab of glue in each section. And this is totally optional, but I just find it easier to hold everything together while I'm working. Then I'm going to grab my paper scissors because I may be cutting through the paper and through the fabric, and I'm going to trim right on the dotted line. Okay, and there we have our A section of the heart. I am going to go ahead and complete section B, and then we'll talk about how to attach those together. Okay, now we have our piece A and our piece B, and all we have left to do is to stitch this center seam to create the design. So there is a 1/4 inch seam allowance here on the center seam. You can leave the papers in and sew it, or you can go ahead and take the papers out if you want. I'm going to go ahead and leave them in, and I'm going to match where my fabrics are here. And honestly, if mine are a little wonky, I'm not that upset about it. But you can clip your seam, or it's small enough you can just hold it, whatever feels more comfortable to you. And then we're just going to sew along that seam line. Okay, and there we have our heart. So I'm going to go ahead and take the papers out from the back, and since we use such a small stitch, this is going to be relatively easy. You might have some projects where it gets pretty tight in the little corners, so you might need a pair of tweezers to do that, but these little pieces are fairly, well, the pieces are fairly large in comparison to the small heart, so they're fairly easy to get out. Of course, where I glued them down, they are a little stuck, but they're not stuck too bad. So yeah, don't use too much glue when you're sticking the papers down. Just enough to help hold it in place while you're doing it. If your stitch isn't quite small enough, it'll be a little bit harder to get the papers out because the needle won't have punctured the paper as many times. So smaller stitch length is always better. And then when we get the papers out, we'd come in here. Obviously we need to trim up some threads, but come in here, press your seams open because there's going to be a lot of bulk at this section right here because of all the seams in there. So if you just press it open, I'm going to use my roller for now, but you can also take this to the iron and press it there as well. Get the whole block pressed. So let's trim up those threads. And then you see that we have our heart. And I was right, mine's a little wonky, but I'm okay with it. Okay, now that we have our heart, for the By Annie Grab Some Grub 2.0 pattern, we need to finish up the edges because this heart is going to get placed on the pattern piece that's with the pattern. So what I'm going to do to finish off these edges are treat them kind of like they have binding on them without actually binding. So I've cut 2 strips that are 1 inch wide and at least as tall as this, if not a little bit taller. I'm going to take this, flip it over, so I have right sides together, and then we're going to stitch at our 1/4 inch seam allowance. I am going to move my machine needle back to its regular placement and not the tiny, tiny little stitch because we don't have paper anymore. So take this to the machine, get your 1/4 inch mark, and stitch the seam. Okay, then we're going to take this other piece of fabric and do the same thing on the other side. Okay. Then we're going to actually open this up and press this away from you, so towards the seam allowance. And then we're going to fold this to the back. So we are not actually turning the seam allowance back. Do you see how the seam allowance is still there? We press this way. Then when we flip this over, we are just going to cover the seam allowance, and we'll have a raw edge right here, but it's going to be sewn on top of that other piece of fabric, so it won't matter. So press this one this way. We're going to flip it, cover the seam allowance, and press it again. At this point, I would probably take it to the iron, but I want to be able to show you guys what I'm doing, so we'll leave it there. So if you want to stitch this, definitely should have taken it to the iron. We could stitch it, edge stitch it right here, right now, along this seam right here to help hold things together. I actually waited until I stitched it to the band for the By Annie bag because it just gave me 1 row of stitching and not 2. So take this to the iron, get it all pressed, and then you should have your heart ready to go. I can't wait to see what you make. Thanks for joining us in the studio.